Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Susan Snow, author of The Other Side of the Gun. It's about your journey from trauma to resilience. Susan, your father was Detective Thomas Williams. He worked for the LAPD in the 1980s. I appreciate you joining me today, and I can't wait to hear your story. It's not the funnest story, but I'm looking forward to hearing.
Well, thank you for having me.
What was life like for you guys as a family, and what was it like being raised as a police officer's daughter?
I get that question a lot. There's good and bad with everything, but I think with my dad, the one thing I can say about him, and I say it all the time, is that he was a very present father,
Mhm.
meaning he always made you the priority, and we had a very close relationship because I was able to tell him everything and anything, and there was no judgment, and that definitely was prevalent as I got older and having some really uncomfortable conversations with him. When I was younger, I dealt with the teasing when I was in elementary school. I happened to go to an elementary school at that time. They bussed kids out from where I lived to another location and trying to integrate kids from different areas. And so I ended up in an elementary school in North Hollywood. Dad was a detective back then as well. And anytime I had to go to the doctor or a dentist appointment, he was the one that took me because he was the closest parent. So he would pick me up in the narc car and take me to my appointments. And the next day I would come to school and everybody would think I got busted for
Uh,
something.
what do you remember? What kind of car was it? Was it a
Oh,
Crown
it
Vic
was it
or?
was usually a Crown Vic, and it was
Yeah.
usually just really ugly. And you know, it screamed narc car, even though he
Yeah.
wasn't a drug, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just screamed that. So the kids that didn't know me and didn't know that my dad was a cop were the ones that were like, "Oh my God, she got busted. I went to a dentist appointment."
Sure, Susan.
Hmm.
Um,
So things like that, and having to get over that. And as I got older, the whole dating thing, there were
what?
some boys that were not very smart, let's just say. And I dated a guy during the summer who was 19 at the time.
Uh-oh.
And he tried to give my dad beer
Oh.
um, to introduce himself. That was kind of dumb because he was underage.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Needless to say, I stopped dating that guy.
Was your dad in law enforcement when you were born, or did he become a cop
When I
during
was
your
about 4 or 5, I believe, is when he graduated the academy.
nice?
I was very young.
Did he put himself through the academy or was he
He
hired
did.
on? He did. Right on.
Yeah, yeah. He had a lot of different opportunities that came up, and he always wanted to be an LAPD officer. I mean, that was just what his goal was, and he made it happen.
That,
And
that,
he worked really hard to rise up in the ranks and become, I think he was a detective too.
how old was he when he joined law enforcement?
Oh gosh, let's see. He was on the force for 13 years. So he was like 32. He was in
In
his
his
30s.
30s. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that's a good age to join. Do you know what did he do before that?
I believe he was Marshal.
Marshal.
Hmm.
Like a US Marshal
I
or
think so.
really? Wow,
Yeah.
that's a cool job.
Yeah. And then
I
he did get an opportunity. West Point actually offered him a position, but he was like, nope, I want to be an LAPD officer. And he turned it down. So
wow.
I
In
didn't
the
even know that. I
military before
learned that
that?
many years later. So I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Hey, everybody has their dream, and so was
Yeah.
he in the military before that?
I believe my dad was in the Army Reserve. I'm
Okay, right on.
Not sure. My grandfather was in the military. They did a lot of traveling as a kid. He was an only child. And yeah, so I mean, he was around the military. He went to a military academy for school.
Mhm.
I think that was Brown Military Academy. And so very much that mentality, very much about serving your country, very
Mhm.
much about, serving the citizens. And that's why he really wanted to serve. And that was his dream and his goal.
So you have siblings
I have one brother
or one
who's
brother?
10 years younger than me. When my dad was killed, he was 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
I was 17.
I guess we could kind of jump into that story since we haven't mentioned that your father was killed, and that's what your book is about.
Yeah,
And if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing your journey and what led up to that event.
sure. So it was Halloween of 1985. Um, you talk about having a normal life prior to this event. Yes, I did. That morning, my dad was getting ready for court. He was testifying in a court case where he was the lead detective, and very nervous about what he was wearing, And as I was helping him get ready for work, because my mom had already left, um, I was telling him about a party that was happening that night. And it was a school night. So I said, I'd like to go with my boyfriend and go to this party. And my dad said, absolutely not. Mm-mm. Nope. It is a school night. You're not going out on a school night. So, anyways, started into a little bit of an argument. Um, and then he dropped me off at school and headed off to court. And the plan for that night was that my dad was going to leave court, go pick up my brother from school, and then my mom would come home from work and we'd all kind of converge and figure out what was happening. Like they were going to take my little brother trick or treating and whatever. But my plan was not that. My plan was I was going to manipulate the heck out of my parents to allow me to go to this party. So came home, cleaned the entire house, top to bottom. And my mom showed up first. She was in her costume from the day's events, and I was getting into my Madonna costume, which tells you the time.
Yeah.
Um, and the phone rang. And I ran into the room where the phone was and picked up the phone thinking that it was my girlfriends, talking about the party and whatever. Like, who's going to call your parents?
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, it was not for me. It was a lady from my brother's school. And all she said to me was that there was a drive-by shooting and my dad was involved. And I really was like, um, I just panicked and handed the phone over to my mom, who came around the corner. And as I was watching her talk to this woman, I could see in her body language and her demeanor that this was not good. So she got off the phone, turned to me, and said, "We're going to this school." So I said, "Okay." So we got in the car, didn't talk to each other all the way there. Um, as I was sitting in the seat, my stomach was just swirling, and I was terrified of what we were going to be in the middle of. I didn't know anything, so there was no information, so we had no idea. The way that the school is set up is there's a front of the school, in the middle of the school, there's a parking lot, and the kids on after school care get out on the back side of the school. So that's where we headed. And as we headed towards there, we saw the lights of the units that were in the back of the school, like lighting up the sky, literally. And then there was an ambulance that sat in the road with its lights on. And we proceeded to keep walking towards that street, and two officers were coming towards us and they had tears in their eyes. And we just ignored it and kept going. And we saw my dad's truck. So we started running towards the truck. And when we started running towards the truck, we saw glass all over on the ground around the truck. And he had been covered up partially, but they covered him right where he fell. And I watched my mom just collapse, scream, and I got hyper focused on that ambulance. I kept thinking, why isn't anyone helping him? Because my 17-year-old brain was not able to connect what I was seeing and what was reality. And soon enough, two officers came and and I sat down on a chair. My mom got pulled aside by some detectives to talk to them. Now, at this point, I had no idea where my brother was. I didn't know if he was hurt. I didn't know what he saw. And I still was not putting two and two together. I was not able to comprehend that what I had actually seen. Um, it wasn't until I heard two women speaking in the office who worked there. And the one lady said to the other one that my dad was deceased. And that's when the sky cracked. I had all of these thoughts in my head of running. I wanted to run out of that room and run away as far as I could get. But my legs felt like cement. My physical body couldn't move. It was a little bit after that my mom came around the corner and she said, "I'm sending you with a neighbor." I know that in that moment I wanted to run away, but in that moment I was still a child and I wanted to be with my family unit. I needed to have that support system. I needed to be with my brother and my mother. Unfortunately, I didn't get that. I was sent away to a neighbor.
Your mom was most definitely in shock then, and people
Absolutely. I mean, it
make
was a chaotic night. I don't blame her for doing that, but there are some repercussions to
yeah.
that decision. My poor neighbor had known me for years, had known my parents for years, and she was trying to wrap her head around what was happening. And here she had his daughter just completely, I was inconsolable. And at that point, all I wanted was my boyfriend. So she called him and she didn't give him any information. So he left work. He was older, he was 19. And he showed up at the door, and I stood there on the porch. And he said, "Okay, grab your jacket. What hospital is he at? Where's your mom? Where's your brother?" Like any, normal person would do. I couldn't say the words. And after a little bit of his prodding, I finally just blurted it out that he was gone. He was just like, "What do you mean he's gone?" And I said, "He's gone. He's not at a hospital. He's gone." And I watched my boyfriend collapse and cry his eyes out. And so here we are, two kids trying to navigate all of this stuff. Most 19-year-old boys would have said, "This is too much. Like, I'm out." But he didn't. He stuck it out with me. And I think he knew that it was going to be a rough road for me. And I needed as many friends around me and support system that I could have. And so he hung out. And I'll tell you, it was like walking into a movie, not one that I recommend. My life went from the normal teenage world, arguing with your parents about going to a party, to my entire block, which was a quiet neighborhood filled with police cars. And we had the helicopters overhead. My whole driveway was filled with cars I've never seen before. That my house was filled with people I've never seen before. And it was just crazy. We had no time to catch our breath. There was just so much going on, and I had no idea how to handle all of this. There was no talk about mental health back then. None. There were no resources for kids. And even within LAPD, unfortunately, they had advocacy that would go to the widow or the widower, but they really didn't have any systems in place for the children, and especially teenage children. So my brother was spared. My dad saved his life. He was with some people taking care of him while my mom was dealing with her own stuff. But I was kind of pushed to the side. It even took the media a couple of days to figure out he had a teenage daughter. So that that played into my mental health as well.
I would imagine it did. Can you take me back to what happened? Did they ever figure out, was he targeted, or was
Yes,
he was
yes.
targeted because of
This
his?
was a planned attack. This was a planned assassination. He was the first officer in the annals of LAPD who has been assassinated for his job. When he was testifying in that case, the main perpetrator, he was out on bail during his trial. So it gave him opportunity. But they had planned this for months and months. The initial case was there was a UA theater that was robbed, a UA theater manager who was robbed by this man who had a limousine service as a cover business. And they robbed him and they tried to shoot him, but the gun jammed. So they panicked, jumped in the car, and drove away. There were several robberies that had happened. So my dad got assigned to that particular case. And the main perpetrator, Daniel Jenkins, um, he had the mentality if there were no witnesses, there's no case.
Mhm.
There were 9 men that were taken into custody. 6 of
Wow.
them were tried, and 3 of them were found guilty. Um, Daniel Jenkins was found guilty and put on death row. He actually was found dead on April 29th of this year.
Oh, wow.
They're ruling it as suicide, but who knows?
We can
And
hope
who
maybe
cares?
not. Yeah, exactly.
He's
Hopefully,
gone.
hope the
That's
worst for
why I
him.
can say his name. His right hand is still in prison. And the third man that was convicted, he got 25 years to life. He served 32, and he was released in 2017.
So coming back to that situation, when did you meet up with your brother, and what was that like, and
It
how
was the
was
next day. That night, I hid in my room. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was trying to process as much as a kid can process, but I was hiding from everybody that night, and I could hear him crying through the night in his room. But I had nothing left, and I was not able to get up out of bed, honestly. I knew my mom would be there for him. And so I really didn't see him until the next day, probably late morning, I think it was. And I just told him I loved him and gave him a hug. And that's all I could do. That was the best I could do for him at that point. They didn't catch these guys for 6 days. So for 6 days, we had police units up and down our street. We had 20 police officers in the front yard, in the backyard. I had bodyguards.
because
My mom had
they knew
bodyguards.
this was intentional?
Yeah,
It,
yeah. And they knew we were a target as well. And I didn't know that until the trial came out. Some evidence came out and some testimony came out. And yeah, So we had no idea at the time, but they were protecting us. Hmm.
So I was in law enforcement for about 10 years, and I've been to one police officer's funeral. I imagine that was a surreal experience down there.
Oh, yeah. It was like a president had died. When I was writing the book, I literally had to talk to my husband about it because when you have CPTSD, your timelines don't mesh. So a lot of my book, I had to rely on other people to kind of put my timelines together. He remembered every single moment, every second of that day. I remember walking out, getting into the limousine, and we were driving up our street, and the street was covered in police officers, and we had the motorcade was like a mile and a half or something. It was just nuts. They shut down major streets. We had people lined on the streets saluting and flags. I mean, it was just like I was like, this is my dad. Like it was like, wow. just I had no idea how to like take this all in. Um,
Yeah, that's got to be really hard. I mean, you're processing one thing, it's like the biggest tragedy you've ever experienced,
yeah.
and on the other hand, you're just like, this is amazing. My dad is a hero, and
Yeah. Yeah, there was signage on the roads that were, condolences to my family and nothing like that had ever happened before. And technically, because it was at a school, it was considered a school shooting. And because he saved my brother's life and my brother was 6, it really made a mark in my community.
so
And
when you say that, was your brother in the vehicle when this happened?
he was in the vehicle and my dad, he had just put him in the vehicle and was walking around the truck to get into the driver's side when he saw what was happening. Um, Turned and told my brother to duck down in the truck. He knew it was happening. So he saved his life. Mhm. Thank God. So it was yeah, I mean the funeral, I've met gentlemen who have been on the detail of that funeral. And to this day, 39 years later, people are still like, I remember that funeral like it was yesterday. And there's been, unfortunately, a lot of funerals since, but I think it was just, it created so much anger and so much pain and so much sadness that just to this day, people that I talk to that either lived in that area or maybe they worked a detail or they were on the force at the time. They still hold that pain. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. Everybody had kind of known my brother's story, my mother's story, but no one really knew me and what I went through and my journey. Um,
What was your journey like after that happened? Obviously, that completely changes your entire life,
oh yeah.
your mother's life. Do you guys stay in that area?
No, so I will say it was very toxic. I'm going to use the word. Everybody deals with trauma and loss differently. Some people choose to use alcohol and drugs and go that route. Um, and that was the route my mom took. She used alcohol to cope. And before this happened, my mom and I's relationship was not healthy.
Mhm.
And my dad was kind of that voice of reason. He was that go between. And once I had that gone, I really struggled with how was I going to have this relationship? How was I going to have any kind of relationship with her? And so when the alcohol came into play, it just made the abuse situation even worse. And I talk about this in my book. So it was kind of a trauma on top of trauma.
Hmm.
And since she was doing her own thing and kind of turtled in, and I was kind of pushed to the side, I had this mentality of, I've got to, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Like, I don't know. I mean, I was having all of the CPTSD symptoms. You know, I was anxiety ridden. Like I had the anxiety, deep depression. That I didn't know what it was called, but I had suicidal ideation. I wanted to be with my dad more than anything. I did not want to be on this earth. I didn't want to be, I didn't want to deal with my relationship with my mother. But at the same time, like I didn't know how to verbalize that, you know?
Hmm.
And at the time, because I lived in a fog for so long, if you just pushed me in a direction, that's the direction I would go.
Hmm.
I was not able to advocate for myself. And LAPD had come to my mom about a month after everything was, you know, the funeral was done and everything, and said, we are going to pay for therapy for all three of you separately. And I didn't know anything about therapy. Like, I thought if you went to a therapist, you were crazy. Like,
Hmm.
I was a kid, so I had no idea. And there was no talk about mental health. So we had no idea. And we just, whatever we picked up as kids is what we thought. So my mom said, you know, we're going to go to therapy. And I said, okay. I had no idea. I had no expectations. I didn't even know what it was about. And in hindsight, I feel like the gentleman that I did see, I talk about trauma competence, and he didn't have any.
Yeah.
I feel like my situation might have been a little bit too much for him, you know, to dive into. And so our sessions were very shallow. They were
Hmm.
just, you know, they were not, he didn't ask me. And I say this, and people go, what? He never asked me how that night affected me. He never asked me the one question that would have allowed me to verbalize the stuff that was going on inside. And so I held it in because I was like, if I tell him these things, he's going to think I'm crazy.
Oh,
So he didn't ask, I didn't tell.
yeah.
And our sessions were all about like my relationship with my mother, my relationship with my brother, my boyfriend, and school. That's
Yep.
it. So
Everything but the problem.
exactly. And
Yeah.
every single week that I saw him for an entire year, I kept saying, today's the day. He's going to help me feel better. Right. Because I was barely existing. You know what I mean? I wasn't really living. I was just kind of floating through life, doing the things that everybody was expecting me to do and act the way that but I was in fight or flight, like totally. And after a year, he said, you're a well rounded young lady and you're going to be fine for the rest of your life. And I don't need to see you anymore. So I left that office thinking, oh my God, I've broken. Like I'm crazy. Not even a professional can help me. I'm just going to, you know, I'm just going to have to deal with all of this stuff my whole life. There's no hope for me. And what I ended up doing internally is I started to listen to what people would say to me, and they'd say things like, oh, you're so strong. You're so brave. You're so this. And that became my emotional mask.
Hmm.
So anytime anything traumatic or anything that happened, instead of really showing my emotions, I would go into that mask mode and be like, nope, nobody on the external side of me is going to see what's going on ever. Like, ever. Now, I married that boy, by the
I
way.
was gonna add.
My husband knew, like, he knew, but neither one of us had the tools or the wherewithal to know what to do. I lived like that for 14 years and we got married and then we had two kids We decided to relocate to Colorado. We moved here in 1997. I was working as a hairdresser at the time. He's always been in construction. And about 2 years in to living here, I was working at a salon that was close to Littleton, Colorado. And on April 20th of 1999, I was doing a client's hair. I put her under the dryer, went into the back room to take a break, turned on the TV, and the Columbine shootings happened.
Oh, shit.
All of the coverage and everything that was going on was in front of me, and I had a visceral reaction. I started flashing back to that night. I saw the ambulance, I saw the police cars, I saw the kids that were around my age. And remember, I was told I was going to be fine for the rest of my life. So I had no idea what was happening to me. I turned pale as a ghost. I was sweating. And my coworker, I didn't tell them my story. Like,
Mm-hmm.
nobody knew my story. She looked at me and said, "What is going on with you? Like, you are too young to have kids there. You told me you lived, in a different part. Like, what?" And I said, I don't know what's going on. Like, I have no idea why I'm reacting like this. And I did what I always do. I put that emotional mask back on. I walked out. I finished my day like nothing happened. Everybody around me was crying and upset and mad and all the emotions, but I was like, nope, this isn't affecting me. But the minute I walked through those doors to go home, all of it came flooding back. All of it, including the suicidal ideation. I knew I was spiraling. Something snapped, and I had all the old feelings. I had the anxiety. I wasn't sleeping at night, which increased my depression. 2 days in, my husband met me at the door and he said, "You have two choices. You either get help or I'm putting you in a hospital." And now I'm a mom. And even though part of me wants to leave this earth, I didn't want to leave my kids. So I threw up the white flag. I said, "Okay, I'll go. Like, I'll go."
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a physician, and the first thing he did was put me on antidepressants because that's what they do. And then he handed me a business card and he said, "You need to make an appointment for this therapist." And I literally laughed in his face. I was like, "Ha, what?" Like, I tried this 14 years ago. It didn't work. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what makes you think it's going to work now? And he said, "You have no choice. This is what you need to do." And I said, "All right, fine." I made an appointment to see this woman. And within the first 3 minutes of sitting down with her, I knew she was different. She told me immediately that she specialized in PTSD. She was a severe trauma specialist and asked me that question, like, "What is going on?" And I told her about what happened at 17 and what I was currently dealing with. And she looked me in the face and she said, "Susan, everything you've gone through since you were 17 is normal because you have PTSD."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What? Like, I wasn't in the military. I didn't go to war. What do you mean?" And she said, "You need to understand that anyone who has ever gone through trauma can experience PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
But what you need to know is that PTSD does not go away. You learn to manage it."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I always describe it as like the sky opened up and rainbows shot out because I literally had hope. I felt like, "Oh my God, you mean I'm not crazy? Like, I'm not going to be stuck like this for the rest of my life and, not know how to move through this stuff and feel like I'm going to die every time I have a panic attack." I was just, I was so taken aback that here she was, this person that was going to, an adult because this is what I've been wanting my whole life, since I was 17. Like, I need an adult to teach me how to move through this, like to my person to come alongside of me and guide me in the right direction and, and help me to heal. And here she was sitting right in front of me. And I was so grateful. I was so grateful. But she also knew she had her hands full. This
Hmm.
is someone who's lived in fight or flight for 14 years. It was a lot. And we had to bite that elephant one bite at a time, you
Hmm.
know?
What kind of, I mean, you've been down this journey and you've been dealing with your PTSD and she's helping you. Is it just the speaking with her and talking about what you've been through that is helping, or what else are you doing to improve that
Oh,
PTSD?
well, she was very diligent in addressing each symptoms.
Hmm.
So initially, I was not sleeping.
Hmm.
I had not slept in a while, and that was increasing my depression. And so we addressed that initially because she said, "What is happening when you lay your head down?" And I told her, as soon as I close my eyes, I go back to that night. I start having dark thoughts, like it's just spiraling in my head. And she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to try. I want you to journal your thoughts." And she said, "You can do it on paper, you can do it through art, you can do it through music, whatever it is that you feel comfortable with." And I've always been a writer, unbeknownst to myself. But I looked at her and I said, "Really? Like, really?
That's it.
Like, are you sure?" She goes, "Trust me." And so I said, "All right." She said, "So I want you to take a notebook, leave it by your bed. And right before you go to sleep, I want you to write down all the things that are swirling around in your head at that very moment." And, I was not optimistic.
I would imagine.
And I said, "Okay, I'll try it." And the first night I did it, I slept a little bit better, but by the second or third night I did it, I slept like a baby.
All
And
right.
I didn't want to like admit it, because it was just so like woo woo to me.
Yeah.
I was like, "What?" But it did. It was powerful what it did for me. And so when I went back the following week, she said, "How did it go?" I was like, "Well, all right,
It
it
was all right.
worked. I've
Right.
been sleeping," So she said, "Great, keep doing that. Like, keep doing that." And so that's still something that I do is I journal. And I think that it's super powerful. If there's that one tiny thing that you can do to try to heal, that is a very powerful one. And I even talked to people who were like, "My podcast is my journal." And I
Yeah.
said, "Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Getting in front of the camera and letting out what's going on with you is therapeutic as well." So, and then we went on to deal with my anxiety, and she taught me some breath work in order to align myself and calm my nervous system and do all of that. And so each thing, but she knew she isn't like going to send me right into the big deal stuff.
Yeah.
So the cognitive therapies that she did introduce to me were uh, light and airy. That's what I say, light and airy. Until we can build up to the big dogs, right?
Yeah.
Which was the EMDR work that I did.
What is
I EM
MDR?
is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Huh.
And
And
so
how
basically,
does
there's
that work?
different ways of doing it. The way that I did it is I had some electric paddles,
Hmm.
and the therapist will initially take you to your happy place. And that's the place you go back when you start to feel overwhelmed.
Hmm.
by the conversation, by where you're going, right? And so they take you back to that space. They take you back to that trauma. And as you're thinking about it, these paddles, the electric pulses go back and forth. And so it's actually a reprogramming of the brain.
Oh,
It's
wow.
incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. And that's why they use it. They use it a lot on the military with PTSD because they're trying to reprogram the brain to lessen the trauma,
Hmm.
like to lessen it so that you're not having that overwhelming feeling when you think about it. So that's the big dog for me. I know that there's more that I can do, but I will say that writing my book was probably the most therapeutic thing I've ever done in my entire life. Like it took 4.5 years to write it
Wow.
because I had to dive and relive and feel all of the same emotions. But this time I had the
Yeah.
tools. I waited until I was 50 to write this book. Drew a line in the sand and I said, I need to get it out. I need to, for myself, for it to be cathartic as well, but to help heal my own family, to help heal the, like I said, the law enforcement folks that were out there that were still feeling the anger and the pain around my dad's death. I felt like if they saw me and how I went through it and how I'm on the other side and in the resiliency side of it, that it would allow them to heal. It would
Hmm.
allow them to feel better about the situation a little bit more. And then over and above all of that, I also felt like there are people out there that have gone through trauma who, like myself, need to have hope
Hmm.
and need to hear a message of it. And so that's why I tell my story, is because I want people to understand you can go through something as horrific as this was. You know what I mean? It's just every trauma is different. And
Yep.
I don't compare my trauma to anybody else.
Yep.
Like your trauma is your trauma, right? And how you deal with it, how it affects you. My lesson in it was that if you do the work, which is super important, and the only way that you can do the work is to be vulnerable
Hmm.
and find your person that will guide you to give you the right modalities that are going to work for you to heal. That's when the true healing starts to happen. That's when you start to rise up from it and it stops controlling you. You're taking your power back.
Hmm.
I had to learn forgiveness, respect. And so my forgiveness and when I forgave these guys was my way of taking my power back and saying, you are not going to hurt me anymore. I'm not giving in to this and I am going to live a wonderful life full of love. And that's what I'm putting out there. And you can't hurt me anymore. Like I have a force field in front of me. Writing the book didn't come without fear.
Yeah.
I did have fear for a couple of different reasons. One, I talked about the way that the relationship was with my mother.
Hmm.
And in telling my truth and being authentic and vulnerable, I had to tell her truth as well.
Hmm.
I was fearful at the time that this may destroy what's left or open up a conversation that we've never had.
Hmm.
The second fear was that it was going to hurt my relationship with my husband. And my third fear was obviously for safety because there were still, at the time, two of them were still in prison.
Hmm.
And so by myself putting myself out there like this, there was that fear. But what I realized in writing it is that this was my purpose. And my purpose of getting my message out of hope and healing was more important than the fear that I felt writing it. So I I have this tagline, bulldoze your fear. I would have to bulldoze it by picturing those faceless people out there that need to hear this message, that need to have this hope. And if I can help one person, I've done my job. And so that's how I kept feeling. And I had days where I would do that. There were days where I had nothing left, like nothing. I am a practicing realtor.
Right.
And there were days where I was like, there is no way I can deal with clients today. I have nothing left. And it's not fair to give less of yourself to your clients. So I was like, I had to give myself grace for those days with no guilt, grace without guilt. And just do things that gave me joy for that one day. And the next day was a different day. So, um,
And
and that's what I tell people, it's not easy doing the work. It's not.
no,
I'm not going to candy coat it. It's really hard. Fear does come up, but when you put your purpose in front of you, it allows you to keep bulldozing through it, keep moving towards your target, whatever that is for you.
I've dealt with a lot of PTSD and some of the law enforcement, military, and just
Hmm.
my brother was killed in a car accident when I was 27. Just all
Hmm.
those things, and they've wrecked my life for a very long time. But what I've learned is those are things that happen to me. They aren't who I am,
Right,
and people need to understand that people who have been abused or gone through tragic losses and everything,
yeah,
that's just something that happened in your life. That doesn't need to define who you are.
right.
And and
Well, and
so,
I feel very like when I say this to some people, they might feel a little uneasy about it. But what I feel is that my purpose is in my dad's death.
mhm,
Now, do I wish that it never happened? Absolutely. If I could have my dad here today, tomorrow, absolutely. But
yeah,
I finally got to a point in my life where I realized that things happen. Yes, they happen to you, but they also happen for you.
mhm,
Because a lot of times you really learn who you are or who you can be. I feel like I'm the person that I've always should have been, but I needed to do the work in order to get here. And obviously, I'm not done. Just because I wrote a book does not mean that I'm done. It's growth and healing is ever evolving. And it's not something that you go through therapy and then you're done, or
mhm.
you write a book and then you're done. But I'm always learning things. But I think the one thing that is really interesting is that once you've gotten to that point where you feel like the person that you want to be or have always wanted to be, I feel like it's important for us to teach others. My goal is to help others. I'm actually a trauma resiliency coach as well as a realtor and a speaker. And the one thing I realized is that people get stuck after they've done the work. People get stuck like, okay, how do I use the skill level or how do I use these tools in all aspects of my life? And so that's where I come into play is helping people move forward, move through fears, move through whatever it is that's keeping them stuck. And I mean, I am meeting people and hearing stories where they're looking at me and they're telling me some really intense, incredible stories where they don't feel like they were in trauma,
Mhm.
but yet they were sexually assaulted as a child, but or molested as a child, because this was their everyday environment and it was it was happening to their cousins and it was like a normal event, they didn't think that that was traumatic.
Yeah.
And so now they're an addict, they're an alcoholic or whatever, and they can't understand. why they're using. Well,
Mhm.
I
Just
had
not
this
normal
conversation
things.
with this woman. Yeah. And I told her, I said, because she says, oh, I haven't gone through trauma like you. And she tells me this story. And I'm like, you have been through trauma. In fact, you've had stackable trauma
Hmm.
your entire life.
Hmm.
And she had gone to rehab 2 other times and for her kids. And I said, have you ever gone to therapy? Have you gone to rehab for you?
Hmm.
And she said, this time it's for me. This time it's for me. And I said, have you ever told anyone in that rehab your story? And she said, no. So I said, do me a favor, tell everyone
Yeah.
that story
Yeah.
because they're going to align you with people who can guide you through this and help you heal. Because if you don't attack this, sobriety is going to be a lot harder.
Yep.
And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and she's just like, you're the first person that's ever said that to me. Like, I have never had this conversation with anyone. I was blown away, but it was a realization that there are people walking on this earth who have gone through some pretty horrific things that don't even realize what it's done to them internally. They
Yeah.
just know that they feel awful, right?
Yeah.
About themselves and about everything around them.
And
Um,
it's so important. I mean, you don't want to be a broken record and just live your trauma, but you need to speak to people about it to be able to process that information. I mean, I
yeah,
have people in my life that I know now who have for 38 years carried around sexual abuse and never told a soul, and finally, working through some different modalities, that person has talked about it and it's changed their life. I mean,
absolutely.
it's if you're going through something,
Yeah.
please don't hold it and keep it
Yeah.
inside
Don't
all
hold
to
it
yourself.
in. Don't
Like,
wear that emotional mask.
no.
That was my vice. That was my mom and my brother. They went down on the addiction side, right? And that's how they coped. My coping skill was even more horrible for myself. It was self-destructive,
Mhm.
right? Pretending that nothing affects you is just as unhealthy. And
Absolutely.
I take full responsibility for that. I just think that for me personally, I always try to give people a safe space by telling my story. I try to give people a safe space to be vulnerable. And it happens when you are able to be vulnerable and tell your story. You're almost giving permission for the other person
Yep.
to tell theirs. And I feel like it's important because in that, as humans, we connect with each other. It's not
Mhm.
trauma bonding,
No.
it's more of, you know, giving people safe spaces without any judgment, just with love, just with listening and giving them that support. And that story I just told you, real estate got a little slow last year. So I started to drive for Lyft.
Hmm.
And um, that was one of my riders. I have had several of these conversations because I keep my book in my car. This was not my idea. This was one of my writers who was head of marketing in her company. And people will pick it up and it starts a conversation. And I'm grateful for that because there
Hmm.
are times where people need to hear that, even if it's like a 10-minute ride,
Yep.
right? And so it's my little way of it becomes a coaching.
People are brought into your life, even in an Uber or a Lyft, that they're meant to meet
Absolutely.
you for whatever reason that is. And I
Yes.
guarantee you're helping people.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm so grateful for it. I feel blessed to be able to do what I do, making some kind of just giving people hope, and just giving them that support system that I didn't have,
yeah.
and my husband and I have always been the family where other kids converge in our household. My friends joke around with me that I collect kids, but not in a weird way.
Yeah.
It's just kids that need extra support. Maybe they don't have a really supportive family life. And we've kind of taken them in and been second parents to them. And I have been very grateful to be able to do that for kids. Also, recognizing that, kids right now are going through so much. There's so much external things that are attacking our kids. And I'm a Gen Xer. You know, we didn't
Yeah.
have phones back then. We didn't have
Yeah, we did.
social
They had the
media back
cords
then.
though.
Right? Our kids are just in a whole different world than we are. And I've been grateful to be able to take my experiences and my lessons and recognize when kids are spiraling and when they're going down a bad, road. My own children have dealt with things like that. And I've been very grateful to be able to step in and say, it's not easy as a parent to look your kid in the face and say, do you want to hurt yourself?
Yeah.
And do you have a plan? No parent wants to do that. But because I've been there, because I've had those feelings, because I've been in that boat, it's given me the opportunity to really be there for younger kids, adolescents and teenagers and young adults, and give them that kind of support that they need and send them to the right people and give them the information of, you need to feel comfortable with your therapist. You need to have that feeling where you can be vulnerable with that therapist enough in order to do the work that you need to do. And
Yeah.
even if that takes 3 or 4 therapists, I think a lot of it too is that people need to understand that your healing is your healing. It's
Mhm.
not their healing,
Yeah.
it's yours. And so it's important. If I can say anything to your listeners, what I would say is make sure if you are on this road to healing that you are interviewing your therapist.
Yeah.
Make sure that they do understand and support and know modalities for your specific trauma because not all trauma is the same and you can't lump them into one category. So you want to make sure that that person is trauma competent, not just that they're informed,
Yeah.
that they're competent in whatever it is that you've gone through.
Susan, I appreciate you coming on the show. If people want to buy your book and get in touch with you, and I do have one quick comment. You need to take your story to law enforcement, police departments. I hope
Oh,
you're
yeah,
doing that because
I
they
did.
need to hear this story. Perfect.
I
Perfect.
did.
How can people get a hold of you and get your book?
Well, there's a couple different ways. My book is on Amazon. It's in paperback form. It's also on Kindle. If you're on Kindle Unlimited, you can actually read it for free. Um,
Don't do that. Pay
but don't
for
do that.
it. Yeah, pay for it.
I'm going to get in a studio and do my audio version of it. Yeah, I will be
That's
doing my own.
that's how I read
And
books because I'm constantly on the
yeah,
road, and so it
exactly.
makes it so
I
easy.
really want to do that so I can relaunch the book as well. The best way to get a hold of me is actually through my website. It's susansnowspeaks.com. Pretty easy. It has information on the book in there. It has information on my speaking. It also has information if you want to get more information on my coaching. You can put your information in there. If you just have questions and you want someone to answer your questions, feel free to contact me. I'm on Instagram and on TikTok. I just started the TikTok journey.
All right. Good luck.
For as long it's gonna stay, I don't know. But my IG is Susan_Snow1, and my TikTok is the same. It's Susan
Perfect.
Snow 1.
I
Yeah.
will tag you in everything. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. You had a crazy, incredible, life, and it's a very healing story to hear. And I am so happy for your growth and progress. And
Thank you.
I thank you very much for coming on. So.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.